The metallic sound of the wall clock in the workshop echoed as I tried to absorb what I had just heard. I stood before the mechanic, his face a mask of concern that contrasted with the familiar smell of oil and grease around us. His words still echoed in my mind. It wasn't an accident, it was sabotage. My throat was dry and my heart racing hammered in my chest. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, trying to mask the disbelief and fear that consumed me. Until then, my grandfather's death had been a terrible blow, a wound that had barely begun to heal. But now, with this new revelation, the wound seemed about to be reopened. The mechanic, a trusted family man for years, nodded slowly. His eyes, which I'd always seen as filled with kindness and sincerity, were now clouded with a shadow of sadness. "I wouldn't bring this up if I wasn't sure," he replied. "When I revisited the car shortly after the accident, I found something strange in the brake seal. And now, with more time, I've been able to confirm my suspicions." He opened a weather-beaten metal box and pulled out a part from my grandfather's car, its surface stained with oil and fingerprints. "See here," he said, pointing to the fingerprints clearly visible under the fluorescent light. "These prints aren't your grandfather's, at least not according to the records we cross-referenced with the police. I didn't need to ask who they were. Something inside me already knew. A part of me that had always refused to believe the worst, but now could no longer ignore the evidence. My father, memories of his sarcastic laugh, and the way he'd always dismissed my grandfather's advice about cars and safety began to come together in my mind like pieces of a macabre puzzle. Why would anyone do that? My voice came out as a whisper, laced with a pain that felt new yet familiar. Why would my own father do that to him? The mechanic sighed, his expression softening into a gesture of empathy. "I don't know, young man. Sometimes people are consumed by things we don't even understand. Envy, anger, greed, it could be anything. But what I do know is that your grandfather didn't deserve this." Anger began to build inside me, heating my blood. I wanted to scream, cry, confront my father right then and there, but I knew I needed time. Time to understand, to process and to prepare for the battle that would unfold from here on out. My mind was in turmoil, but one thing was clear. I couldn't let this go unanswered. I looked at the piece in my hands, the cold, heavy metal like a symbol of what I would have to face. It was time to go back in time, to explore every memory, every conversation, every detail that might have been an unnoticed clue. It was time to discover how it all began, and why fate so cruelly had brought me here. "Thank you for showing me this," I said to the mechanic, my voice steady despite the inner turmoil. "I need to understand how this all unfolded. I need to go back in time to explain how we got here." And so, with renewed determination and a heavy heart, I prepared to face the past in search of the truth. The silence hung heavy in the workshop, broken only by the distant sound of tools and engines in the background. The mechanic stood before me, holding the metal part as if it were a relic both sacred and profane. I couldn't look away from the fingerprints, unmistakable marks that seemed to scream the truth of a crime hidden beneath the facade of a tragic accident. "This is crazy," I whispered, more to myself than to him, as I tried to process the magnitude of the revelation. My father had been the hand that caused my grandfather's death, the man who had taught me everything about loyalty and respect. The ground beneath my feet seemed to give way, but I forced myself to maintain my composure, to not break at what was to come. "I know it's hard," the mechanic said, his voice low and full of compassion. "But you needed to know. He wasn't just your grandfather. He was a great man, and this shouldn't have happened. You have to decide what to do with this information." His words resonated within me, cutting through the labyrinth of emotions that had formed there. Anger boiled. But it wasn't just the anger of a betrayed grandson. It was the indignation of someone who realized that justice had been usurped by those who should protect and honor the family. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to contain the turbulence that threatened to overflow. Images from the past surfaced like fragments of a forgotten film. My father's laughter, his disdain for my grandfather's advice, the moments when he scoffed at the safety precautions my grandfather always made a point of following. All of this now seemed like a harbinger of what was to come, clues I had ignored, blinded by trust and filial love. "I need to understand," I murmured, looking back down at the piece in my hands. The cold metal seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a constant reminder that time would not erase what had been done. I need to know why he did it. What was the reason that drove him to betray his own father? Tears threatened to fall, but I swallowed them back along with the pain. My grandfather had been my anchor, the beacon that guided my path in times of darkness. And now, even in his absence, he continued to guide me, to push me toward the truth and justice he had always valued. "I'll find out," I declared, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I'll go back in time, revisit every memory, every conversation, every suspicious gesture. If my father did this, I want to know why. I'll understand how we got here, and I'll ensure my grandfather's memory is honored." The mechanic nodded, his eyes filled with silent sympathy. He knew I had crossed a threshold, that there was no turning back. The path ahead was filled with pain and uncertainty, but also with the promise of truth, something I could no longer ignore. With one last look at the piece in my hands, I knew this was just the beginning, a painful but necessary beginning to a path I was about to embark on. I needed to return to the past, to unravel all the secrets hidden in the shadows of my own family. And so, with the weight of revelation on my shoulders, I took the first step toward facing what lay ahead, determined to bring to light the truth that cruel fate had thrust upon me. The workshop was thickly silent, save for the occasional clanking of tools in the background. The piece of metal I held seemed to burn in my hands, a reminder of all that had unfolded. But now, as reality sank in, my mind was transported back to a day many years ago, when everything had seemed so much simpler. I must have been about 10 years old at the time. I remember being at my grandfather's house, a place that always exuded the comforting aroma of polished wood and fresh coffee. He was in the garage, as always, tinkering with his old car with the dedication he reserved for everything he loved. I stood beside him, watching in fascination as he patiently explained to me how each part worked, as if revealing the secrets of a hidden universe. It was one of those lazy summer days, the sun bathing everything in a golden glow. My father arrived late, bringing with him the impetuous energy and impatience that always accompanied him. He walked into the garage, the sound of his shoes echoing off the walls, and looked at us with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, still playing with those old things, Dad?" he scoffed, leaning against the door with his arms crossed. "Why don't you think about trading in that car for good? I bet a new one would be easier to maintain." My grandfather was unfazed. He looked at his son with a serenity I've always admired, the kind of calm that comes from a life well lived and hard-won wisdom. "Of course, a new car would be easier," he replied, a soft smile on his lips. "But maintenance and care teach us patience and respect, things you can't find anywhere." My father laughed, a short, dismissive sound, as if my grandfather's words were mere nonsense. "Respect for a bunch of rusty metal? That's what museums do, not normal people, Dad." I remember feeling a pang of discomfort, a childish embarrassment at seeing such disrespect towards someone I admired so much. My grandfather, for his part, maintained his composure, ignoring the provocation with characteristic dignity. "Everyone has their own priorities, son," he said, turning his attention to me as if confiding a secret. "The point is to know what yours are and follow them, no matter what others say." Those words have stayed with me ever since, echoing in moments of doubt and insecurity. But that afternoon, my father's laughter rang out louder, a manifestation of his disdain for what he considered outdated and worthless. He left the garage not long after, his presence leaving a trail of callousness and disregard. I turned my gaze to my grandfather, expecting to see some sign of sadness or irritation, but he only smiled at me, a smile that spoke of infinite love and patience. "One day you'll understand, my boy," he murmured as he returned to his work. "What matters is not what we have, but what we do with it." And now, years later, with the piece of metal still in my hands, those memories hit me with painful clarity. My grandfather always knew the value of things that truly matter, while my father seemed to live in a world of superficiality, where value was measured in tangible and immediate possessions. The irony is that my grandfather, with his patience and wisdom, had taught me more in a single summer day than my father had in a lifetime of empty words. And there, in the silence of the workshop, I realized that this was the legacy I wanted to honor, the legacy of a man who never let himself be defined by other people's expectations. I took a deep breath, feeling determination solidify in my heart. I knew what my next step was. I needed to find out more, to understand what had driven my father to such betrayal. But one thing was certain: the path I would choose would be guided by the principles my grandfather had so lovingly instilled in me. And so, with this renewed certainty, I prepared myself to face what lay ahead. The sound of the engine being shut down marked the beginning of another visit to the mechanic's shop. It was a routine I'd maintained since my grandfather passed away, a ritual of maintenance and remembrance. However, that day, as I walked across the worn concrete floor, I sensed something was different. There was a tension in the air, something almost palpable that coiled around me. The mechanic, a man with a weather-beaten face and skilled hands, nodded to me. His eyes, which used to radiate tranquility, were now somber, as if reflecting a concern he hadn't yet voiced. I approached as he wiped his hands on a stained cloth. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light, even though the tightness in my stomach told me something was coming. He hesitated, a heavy silence falling between us. Finally, he sighed, as if about to release a secret weighing on his conscience. "I need to talk to you about your grandfather's car," he said, his voice low and serious. My heart skipped a beat, the familiarity of the subject bringing a wave of nostalgia along with a chill. "What about him?" I asked, trying to ignore the feeling that I was about to hear something that would change everything. The mechanic looked around, as if making sure we were truly alone. He leaned a little closer, and I could see the glow of the shop light reflecting in his eyes. "When I checked your grandfather's car after the accident, I found something I couldn't understand at the time." I felt my chest tighten, anticipation and fear intertwining in a torturous dance. "What did you find?" My voice came out a whisper, thick with an anxiety I couldn't contain. He swallowed hard before continuing. "There was something wrong with the brake seal. It didn't look like normal wear and tear. It was like it had been tampered with, and I haven't been able to get it out of my head since." The revelation hung in the air, an ominous shadow that threatened to swallow everything I knew to be true. "You're saying the accident wasn't an accident?" The words came out shakily, the thought of sabotage sweeping through my mind like a storm. "Exactly," he confirmed, his expression grave. "I didn't mention anything before because I wasn't sure, but after reviewing it again, my suspicions were only confirmed." The floor seemed to shake beneath my feet, and I grabbed a nearby bench for support. "How is this possible? Who would do something like this?" The mechanic shook his head, sadness darkening his features. "I have no idea why anyone would do this, but you needed to know. It was the only way to honor the memory of the man your grandfather was." Gratitude and confusion warred within me as I tried to process the enormity of what I had just heard. Sabotage. Someone had deliberately caused my grandfather's death, breaching our family's security in a way I could never have imagined. "I don't know what to do with this," I admitted, my voice breaking under the weight of the revelation. "How am I going to deal with this truth?" The mechanic, with silent understanding, placed a hand on my shoulder. "You'll find a way," he said, his tone firm and encouraging. "Your grandfather was a man of principle, and you are just like him." As his words resonated in my heart, I felt a determination begin to form, a silent commitment to seek the truth and honor my grandfather's memory. I knew the path ahead would be difficult, filled with pain and uncertainty, but I also knew I could not ignore what had been revealed. With one last look at the mechanic, who had become an unexpected ally, I took a deep breath and prepared myself for what was to come. I needed answers, and I was willing to go to any lengths to find them. Not for myself, but for the man who taught me the value of facing the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The cold wind bit my face as I walked to the town's small library, a place my grandfather always called the real treasure. He used to spend long afternoons there, immersed in books and stories that seemed to give him a unique perspective on life. Now I needed that same kind of inspiration, something that could help me piece together the puzzle his death had left behind. Inside the library, the scent of aged paper and polished wood was comforting, like a warm embrace from the past. I walked through the aisles until I found the local history section, where my grandfather had spent so many hours. I sat in one of the worn leather armchairs, feeling the weight of recent events still pressing on my heart. It was strange how the words of someone who had passed away could hold so much power. I remembered a story my grandfather used to tell about a group of friends who, united by a common passion, managed to achieve impressive feats, even when the odds seemed against them. It was a story about loyalty and courage, things I desperately needed at that moment. I decided I needed to seek out these friends of my grandfather, those who had been with him throughout his life and might have clues about what was happening. They were like a second family to him, and I hoped they could offer a new perspective on what my father might have done and why. After a few calls, I managed to meet with two of them. The first, Mr. Elias, was a tall, striking man with eyes that seemed to see beyond the obvious. The other, Mr. Ricardo, was shorter and stockier, with an easy smile and a welcoming manner that made me feel at ease. We met at a cafe near the library, a place that seemed frozen in time. The conversation flowed naturally at first, full of memories and laughter about my grandfather. But as the afternoon wore on, I got to the topic that had really brought me there. Do you remember anything my grandfather mentioned about my father? Any fights, disagreements, anything that might explain what happened? I asked, the urgency evident in my voice. Elias exchanged a meaningful look with Ricardo before answering. Your grandfather was always reserved about family matters, Elias began, taking a sip of coffee. But he occasionally mentioned his concern about the path your father was taking. He sensed a growing distance between them. Ricardo nodded, adding, Your grandfather never gave up hope for reconciliation. He always believed that time could heal their relationship. But he also said your father was getting involved with people who weren't trustworthy. Those words echoed in my mind, fueling a storm of thoughts and assumptions. Could some outside influence have driven my father to commit such a horrible act? Do you have any idea who these people might be? I asked, hope and despair intertwining in my voice. Elias frowned as if trying to recall something important. There was a name that came up a few times, Rogerio. I think he had business dealings with your father, something related to shady investments. Rogerio. The name rang familiar, like a distant bell ringing in my memory. I needed to find out more about him, understand what kind of influence he had on my father, and why my grandfather was so worried. My gratitude for those men was immense, for even without realizing it, they had illuminated a path I needed to follow. With their memories and clues, I now had new clues to explore, a chance to do justice to my grandfather. As we said goodbye, I promised myself that I wouldn't let the truth be buried, along with the doubts. I would dig deep, discover what really happened, and honor the legacy of a man who taught me to always seek the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Elias and Ricardo's words echoed in my mind as I parked the car in front of my parents' house. The sun was already setting on the horizon, tinting the sky orange and red, as if even the universe sensed the emotional storm to come. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions threatening to engulf me. I needed to be strong, focused. This was the conversation that would change everything. I opened the gate slowly, the metallic creak as loud as my heartbeat. I walked through the well-tended garden, the flowers my mother loved so much swaying in the wind, oblivious to what I was about to do. The front door was ajar, as if fate were inviting me to enter and confront the truth. I found my father in the living room, his gaze absently fixed on the television, a scene of tranquility that would soon be shattered. He looked up at me, his initially welcoming smile fading as he saw the seriousness in my expression. Son, what a surprise. I didn't know you were coming today, he said, his voice thick with a familiarity that cut through me like a knife. We need to talk, I replied, the coldness in my tone surprising even myself. I walked to the coffee table and placed the part from my grandfather's car on it, the metal gleaming in the soft light of the lamp. The change in his expression was instantaneous. The smile disappeared, replaced by a palpable tension. What is it? He asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. You know what it is, I said, struggling to remain calm. It's the part from Grandpa's car, the same one that was tampered with. The fingerprints on it are yours. A dead silence fell between us, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. I could see the internal battle unfolding on his face, the walls of denial rising, only to be shattered by the force of the evidence. This is ridiculous, he began, forcing a laugh that sounded fake and desperate. You think I would do something like that? To my own father? That's exactly what I think, I replied firmly, though my heart begged me not to. Please be honest with me. Why did you do this? What did Grandpa do to deserve this from you? He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't understand," he snapped, anger and frustration boiling over. He never believed in me, always underestimated me. I was tired of living in his shadow. His words were like poison, each syllable corroding the image I had of the man who raised me. I fought back the tears, knowing I needed clarity. "So you thought taking his life was the answer? How could you do that, Father?" He looked away, unable to sustain my accusation. "I didn't want it to end like this," he murmured, guilt beginning to seep through the cracks in his facade. "But it's over," I said, my voice steady, even as my world crumbled. "And now there's no going back. I can't be a part of this anymore." The decision was made, clear and unshakable. I looked at him, the man I had once idolized, and realized this was a goodbye. A break not only between father and son, but between the past and what I wanted to build in the future. "I will honor Grandpa's memory," I declared, the promise sealing our fate. "And that means I'm going to walk away. I can't stay and pretend nothing happened." He didn't answer, just watched me as I picked up the metal piece and headed for the door. With each step, I left behind not just a house, but a life I no longer recognized as my own. As I crossed the threshold, twilight enveloped me, offering solace as I walked away. I knew the journey ahead would be full of challenges, but I was also confident that, for once, I was heading in the right direction. No matter what the future held, I would be guided by my grandfather's principles, and this truth, however painful, would give meaning to everything that was yet to come. Walking through the rusty gate of my grandfather's old garage was like opening a portal to a simpler time, a refuge that now promised a new beginning. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows, illuminating the carefully organized tools that seemed patiently waiting to be brought back to life. My heart raced with a mix of nostalgia and determination. This was the place where I would do justice to my grandfather's legacy. For weeks I had worked tirelessly, cleaning, organizing, and imagining what this garage could become. It wouldn't be just any workshop. It would be a sanctuary of innovation and safety, a tribute to the values my grandfather always championed. Every piece of metal, every screw and every tool told a story of dedication and passion, and I was determined to honor them as best I could. As I walked through the space, my mind filled with ideas. I envisioned an area dedicated to research and development of vehicle safety technologies, a crucial point my grandfather always emphasized. He believed that safety was the backbone of any vehicle, a priority that should not be sacrificed for the sake of profit. With this vision in mind, I began planning how I could integrate technological innovation with the traditional knowledge he had passed on to me. Memories of our time together guided me. I remembered how he'd said that a well-maintained car was like a work of art, requiring patience and respect. It was this philosophy I wanted to convey to my future clients, something that would make them feel not only secure in their vehicles, but also renewed respect for the art of caring for them. I decided that one of my first innovations would be to develop an affordable and effective safety monitoring system, something that would alert drivers to any potential problems before they became a threat. The idea was simple yet powerful, and it represented a natural extension of what my grandfather had always believed. Prevention was better than cure. Lost in thought, I was brought back to the present by the sound of the garage door opening. It was Sarah, my longtime friend and talented engineer, who had joined me on this endeavor. She entered with a smile, carrying a toolbox that seemed too heavy for her size. "It's starting to take shape," she said, looking around approvingly. "Your grandfather would be proud." Those words touched something deep inside me, a confirmation that I was on the right path. "Thank you, Sarah," I replied, feeling gratitude overflow. "I couldn't do this without you." Together we began discussing next steps, sharing ideas and setting goals. Sarah was an invaluable ally, her technical expertise complementing my vision for the garage's future. Our partnership was more than a professional collaboration. It was a union of dreams and goals, a commitment to creating something that would make a difference. As the day wore on, the sound of tools and the hum of machinery filled the air, the garage taking on new life. There was a rhythm, a cadence to the work that was both exhausting and invigorating. Every small achievement was celebrated, every challenge faced with the resilience I had learned from my grandfather. By late afternoon, the garage was beginning to resemble what I'd imagined. The development area was equipped, the first prototypes of our security system were taking shape, and a sense of purpose permeated the space. All of this, however, was just the beginning, a promising start to a new chapter. As I hunched over an engine, fine-tuning the day's final details, I felt a surge of satisfaction. The journey to honor my grandfather had begun with pain and uncertainty, but now it had become a mission of love and hope. The garage wasn't just a business. It was an extension of his life and wisdom. As I pulled out of the garage that night, I looked up at the stars beginning to twinkle in the dark sky, knowing that wherever he was, my grandfather was smiling. And so, with my heart full and my mind focused on the future, I closed the door behind me, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The morning was cold and foggy when I decided to stop by my parents' house. There was something I needed to see for myself. Since our last conversation, a chain of events had begun to unfold, something I could only describe as poetic justice. As I approached the quiet street where I grew up, I noticed something different. The garden, once meticulously tended by my mother, seemed neglected, as if the time and attention she had previously devoted to it had vanished. The wilted flowers and the weeds sprouting among them were a silent symbol of the changes taking place within the house. I parked the car and hesitated before getting out. A part of me didn't want to see, didn't want to accept that the man I once admired was facing the consequences of his actions. But I knew I needed to witness this, needed to understand the depths of karma's reach. As I approached the door, I heard heated voices coming from inside. My father's voice, normally so firm and authoritative, now sounded desperate, almost pleading. He was on the phone, his conversation punctuated by frustrated pauses. "But you promised me the investment was safe, Rogerio. You can't just leave me hanging now." His words carried a palpable tension, an urgency I'd never sensed before. I remembered what Elias and Ricardo had mentioned about Rogerio, the name that held considerable weight in our history. This was the man who, it seemed, had played a crucial role in my father's downfall. A business partner who had now abandoned him to his fate. The conversation continued, and I remained in the doorway, invisible but listening intently. "I've already lost so much money on this. I can't afford any more." "You have to help me get out of this," my father pleaded, his pride shattered with every word. Finally, he hung up, a heavy silence filling the space. I heard the sound of footsteps and quickly hid behind the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I peeked out in time to see him emerge from the house, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the world. The man who had always maintained such a proud posture now seemed smaller, almost unrecognizable. He got in the car and drove off, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I watched his figure fade away, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. There was a quiet relief in seeing that the universe was somehow balancing the scales. But there was also a sadness, a mourning for the man my father could have been, had he not allowed himself to be consumed by his own insecurities and inordinate ambitions. I entered the house, the silence inside reflecting the emptiness I felt. The walls, once vibrant with family photos and happy memories, now seemed somber. My mother stood in the kitchen, her movements automatic as she washed a stack of dishes. Seeing me, she gave me a sad smile. "Is going through a hard time," she said, as if that explained everything. There was a weariness in her voice that hadn't been there before, a resigned acceptance of a reality she couldn't change. "I know," I replied, unsure whether to feel sorry or let karma take its course. "But he needs to understand that some things just can't be fixed." She nodded, her eyes filled with quiet wisdom. "Choices have consequences," she commented, more to herself than to me. As I left, the image of my father, desolate and without allies, lingered in my mind. He was reaping what he had sown, and though part of me wished I could help him, I knew it wasn't my responsibility. I had my own path to follow, one that honored my grandfather's legacy and the values he instilled in me, and so, with a mixture of relief and regret, I left the house behind once more, determined not to let the past define my future. The doorbell rang the next morning, the sound echoing through the silent house like a harbinger of something inevitable. I rose from the chair by the window, where I had spent the last hour lost in thoughts of what the future held. When I opened the door, there he was, my father, with an expression I had never seen before. The haughtiness he always carried was gone, replaced by a despair that seemed to consume every part of him. He was dressed sloppily, his clothes wrinkled, as if he'd spent the night without sleep. His eyes, once hard and calculating, were now dull, reflecting a tormented soul. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Words stuck in her throat as she stared at him in silence. "Can I come in and talk?" he asked, his voice heavy with a weariness that seemed to weigh tons. There was a tremor in his hands, a sign that pride had finally given way to vulnerability. I nodded, moving aside to let him pass. He walked into the living room and sat heavily on the sofa, his hands clasped together as if about to confess his sins. I sat across from him, the coffee table between us, a symbolic barrier representing everything that had happened. "I know you have no reason to listen to me," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But I have nowhere else to go." The words hung in the air, each syllable laden with palpable guilt. I didn't respond immediately, trying to process the situation as he continued. "I've lost everything," he admitted, despair etched in every line of his face. "My business, my friends. Everyone's turned their backs on me. I'm broke." I looked at him, the man who had once been my hero, now reduced to fragments of his own choices. It was hard to reconcile the image of the father who taught me to ride a bike with the man who stood before me, begging for help. "Why did you come to me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "After everything that's happened, why do you think I should help?" He ran his hand over his face, a futile attempt to hold back the unshed tears. "Because you're all I have left. I know I'm not worthy of asking this, but I need a second chance." His words were like needles, each one piercing the layer of anger and disappointment I'd built around my heart. Part of me wanted to reach out, to offer the help he so desperately begged for. But another, more rational part knew that some things are irreparable. "I don't know if I can," I murmured, my voice betraying the internal battle I was waging. "Not after what you did to Grandpa." He lowered his head, a gesture of defeat that hit me hard. "I know," he replied, barely audible, "and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need to try to make things right. I know I messed up, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to change." The silence hung between us, heavy and full of unspoken meaning. I wanted to believe him, wanted his words to be true, but something inside me hesitated. How could I ever trust someone again who had destroyed so much? "You have to understand," I began, choosing my words carefully. "This isn't a decision I can make right now. What you did, it affected everything, changed everything." He nodded, a sad understanding in his gaze. "I know, and I'll accept whatever decision you make. I just had to try." I stood, signaling our conversation was over. He stood too, his shoulders hunched under the weight of what was to come. As I walked him to the door, a part of me wanted to offer comfort, but I realized it wasn't my responsibility to heal his wounds. "Take care," was all I could say, before I slowly closed the door, a gesture that felt final. I stood there for a while, staring at the closed door, reflecting on everything that had happened. I knew the road ahead would be complicated, full of difficult decisions. But as the silence settled around me, I realized that whatever choice I made, I was determined to follow my own path, guided by the principles my grandfather had taught me. The morning was chilly, and the air held a weight that seemed to press down on my shoulders as I walked through the house. The conversation with my father still echoed in my mind, each word a painful reminder of the choices he'd made and the inevitable consequences he now faced. I knew he was somewhere out there, waiting for an answer, but I needed a moment alone, a moment of clarity before making the final decision. I crossed the living room to the small bookshelf where our family memories were stored. Among the dusty picture frames, I found a photo of my grandfather. He was standing next to his antique car, the same one he cared for so lovingly, his smile radiating a quiet confidence I'd always admired. I picked up the photo, gently wiping away the accumulated dust with my fingertips. His eyes, even in a still image, seemed to encourage me to move forward, to choose the path he always wanted for me, a path of honesty and justice. I felt a wave of emotions as I looked at him, a mixture of sadness for what we lost and gratitude for the legacy he left. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. What my father did was unforgivable, a breach of trust so profound it couldn't be mended. Still, he was my father, and part of me wanted to find a way to help him. But another part, the part my grandfather had nurtured with principles and values, knew I couldn't sacrifice my integrity, no matter how much it hurt. With the photo still in hand, I walked to the window. The sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting golden rays that illuminated the room with a soft, hopeful glow. It was as if the universe was telling me that, despite everything, there was light at the end of this tunnel. It was at that moment that the certainty hit me. I had to be firm. I had to be true to myself and to my grandfather's memory. I couldn't give in. I couldn't allow my father's manipulation and desperation to divert me from the path I'd chosen. I turned back to the door, my resolve solidified in my heart. My hand still clutched the photo as I slowly opened the door, finding my father outside. He was sitting on the wall, his eyes fixed on the ground, as if waiting for me to be his salvation. "Father," I began, my voice firm, but not without compassion. He looked up, a glimmer of hope lighting his face for a brief moment. "I've thought long and hard about what you said," I continued, choosing my words carefully. "And I want you to know that it hurts me to see you like this. But I also need to be honest. He didn't speak, he just listened, every word of mine seeming to weigh on him like an inevitable sentence. I can't help him," I declared, the final decision coming out as a sigh of relief and sadness. "I can't, because that would mean betraying everything Grandpa stood for, and I can't do that." The silence that followed was thick, every second filled with unspoken emotions. He lowered his head, a barely perceptible nod of understanding and acceptance. "I understand," he murmured, his voice choked with defeat. I held my grandfather's photo a little tighter, feeling his invisible support. "I hope you find a way to make things right," I said, trying to convey a shred of hope. "But I need to move on. I need to keep honoring who he was." He nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," was all he could say, every word laced with regret. With one last look, I said goodbye to him, knowing this was the end of a painful story. As he walked away, I went back inside, my heart heavy but determined. I put my grandfather's photo back on the shelf, a silent promise that I would continue to live by his values. The sun shone brighter through the window, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the darkness begin to lift. I was ready for the future, a future built on the truth and integrity my grandfather so cherished. And with it, a sense of empowerment finally enveloped me, a force that would guide me forward.